Okay, so for our next tree, we're going to do the South Florida slash pine, Pinus elioti densa. And most of the time with trees, it's not very nuanced. You can tell the difference of the different species. It's pretty clear cut if you've been exposed to, if you've been observant of trees for a long time. But got some dogs howling in the background to a train. But anyway, there's a few differences. One is the needle length. The needles of South Florida slash pine are pretty long. They're on average about 10 inches long. Sometimes they can be as long as about 12 to 13 inches long. They can be almost the length of a longleaf pine, but usually not quite. But they are longer than your typical slash pine, which have needles that are about 7 or 8 inches or so long. The growth pattern, as you can see, it's not uncommon. Sometimes the branches tend to be a little bit more sparse. Not always, but you see, especially in mature trees, the branching pattern almost looks a little bit like a longleaf pine. The plates on older trees, compared to your typical slash pine, if I could see that very well, let me zoom in a little bit, tend to have pretty large plates on the mature trees. And the needles are mostly in twos. If I were to take a sample of 20 needles, probably, I don't know, give or take about 18 or so will be in twos, and there'll be two bundles that will be in threes. Another distinction of this variety of slash pine is the seedlings grow through what's called a grass-like seedling stage. This one's growing in the shade. It's growing through a grass-like seedling stage. It's even more apparent if they're growing in full sun. In that case, the stem is, a lot of times, are buried underground, and that's there to protect them from fire. Very similar to longleaf pine, South Florida slash pine seedlings grow through a grass-like seedling stage, and again, it's protect them from the fire. So that is, if there is a fire, the pine will survive. Typical slash pine, I think, if I remember reading correctly, they're not as fire tolerant as this variety of the densa variety. So what about the range? Well, the range, they grow in the lower Keys. They grow in South Florida, and they grow up into Central Florida. And they grow up probably about to Central Brevard on the east side, about, I don't know, I'd say maybe Southern Polk and Southern Osceola in the interior, and Pinellas County or so, maybe Newport Richey or so on the west side of Florida. Another thing I want to show you real quick is the pine cones. See, the pine cones on your South Florida slash pine tend to be a little bit smaller, and they have that characteristic rounded bottom. They have a little more of an oval shape to them, whereas your typical slash pine have bigger pine cones than this. So too bad I don't have a typical slash pine to compare it to. It'd be a lot better, but hopefully you get the gist of what this is. And then genetically, I think they've done a genetic test of the ones in South Florida and Pinellas County, and they find that they're actually more related to a longleaf pine than they are to typical slash pine. So that's kind of an interesting tidbit. Especially if you consider in Central Florida, there's probably a lot of cross pollination of the two varieties, so you can't tell the difference between the two. Say if you're in Brevard or East Orange County, you'll probably have sort of an intermediate between the two varieties of slash pine. So again, telling the difference is kind of nuanced a little bit. So anyway, that's your South Florida slash pine, Pinus elioti variety densa.